Okay, so welcome everybody. I want to welcome you both to a new series, which I just said we did not plan to, knowing that Israel was going to be all over current events when we came up with the idea for the series a couple months ago. But obviously we had to pivot and talk about current events. And I actually don't want to make this a ton about the events of the past 5 days. I'll introduce what happened in the last 5 days just in terms of the concrete details for those that might need a little bit of a refresher. But from what I've been hearing from people that I've been talking to, which is a lot of people in the last couple of days, is everybody's aware of the news. Everybody's been constantly refreshing the news at probably an unhealthy level. I know I've also been refreshing the news at an unhealthy level. A lot of people just want wider context, and a lot of people are hearing all these terms on the news. They're hearing Hamas, they're hearing the Gaza Strip, they're hearing blockade, they're hearing Egypt. All of these different dates are thrown out, the disengagement from Gaza, the 6-day war. And a lot of people might not be able to connect all of the dots in a way that I think is important, both just for our communal understanding of the history of the Gaza Strip, what we might be seeing in Israel and Gaza over the next couple of weeks, months, or perhaps even years, depending on how long this conflict lasts. And then also on the other important angle, as we were talking about right before we started recording, there's a lot of misinformation, sadly, that's been circulating on social media, on the internet. There's sort of always this funhouse mirror type effect whenever there is an event like this in Israel. And Saturday, Shabbat morning, it was also Simchat Torah, was the deadliest attack in Israel's history. And so, of course, we would expect there to be the usual amounts of misinformation, the usual amounts of people to try to co-opt information on both sides. And a lot of the information, and especially a lot of the misinformation, I think is specifically prying on the fact that most people don't know the germane and the wider zoomed out history. So I thought that it would be helpful to talk about a lot of that. And then at the end, of course, we can talk about some current events and we'll talk about why it's relevant here. But this is what I thought to myself might be what I personally think I can provide the best, and what I think from just hearing from a lot of students and hearing from a lot of other community members, that it might be helpful. Before we do that, because of course, this is a time where Israel is still in the middle of an active situation. There are many of our community members, many of our family members, many of our friends who are still interacting in either helping find bodies. I know my cousin was deployed to the Gaza border, right? We know that this is long from over, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why this conflict with Israel and Gaza might turn out to drag on for a couple of weeks. So I just wanted to say one quick prayer at the outset. This is the prayer for the state of Israel, just to center our studying, just to center our learning, to have kavana, to have intentionality, that we are studying for the sake of thinking of Israel and thinking about the safety of everybody there. So I will just read the prayer real quick, and then we will begin. Avinu Shabashamayim, Tzur Yisrael v'Goalo, Barech et Medinat Yisrael, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. Hagen Aleha be'avaret chastecha, Ufros Aleha sukat shlomecha. Ushlach orecha ve'ematecha l'rasheha, Sareha v'yotzeha, v'tekanem be'etza tova melpanecha. Chazek et yedei nignei eretz kachenu, v'hinachilenu Eloheinu Yeshua, V'ateret nitzachon te'atrim, v'natata shalom ba'aretz, v'simchat olam leyoshvaha. So, of course, while we're going to talk about a lot of the history, and while everybody here, I think, is familiar with my teaching style, that I really do always try to paint history with nuance and to try to always, it's the sort of old Jew in me that always tries to give multiple sides, multiple perspectives. I want to make it clear from the outset that the events of this past weekend do not have multiple nuanced sides and perspectives. It was a horrific attack. And of course, we are praying for all of the soldiers that are now being stationed in Gaza. And we are praying for the 2,500 people who were injured. We're praying for the 130 people that are still in captivity, as we begin to unpack a history that is very much filled with nuance and all of these things and multiple sides. The last thing that I want to say just by introduction, and then we can actually pause for some questions out of here, is somewhat ironic, somewhat, I think, telling when it comes to a lot of what we've been seeing in terms of what's been coming out in terms of social media and what's been coming out in terms of the way in which a lot of popular figures in, say, the media or Hollywood or the music industry are talking about this in terms of them lauding this as somehow some great victory for social justice, depending on how much people here are on social media and how close to the age of college student people here are. You might be seeing that some more than others. I can tell you from the perspective of current students in college, there is a lot on social media and also coming from academic departments that is trying to spin this entire thing to be a great victory for people who are oppressed over the oppressors. And this is clearly, of course, anti-Semitism, because I don't know any account of any peoples in the world that underwent an attack on their community where dozens of babies were killed and somehow people were able to thumb wave and spin it to being well, you have to understand the nuance on both sides, right? That only really happens when it comes to Jews, right? Another way to say that is anti-Semitism, just to understand, and I know we've discussed this in Temple Beth Tikva circles before, but just to really understand the philosophy behind Zionism. Because actually, generally, when we teach about Zionism, and this is something that I was talking about with a group of students about 2 hours ago at UC Irvine, we tend in the current American Jewish community, at least for my entire life, to talk about Israel and Zionism as a very happy thing, a celebratory thing, a very positive in terms of, isn't this great? We have a homeland, right? Probably most young people's primary affiliation with Israel is going on birthright, right? You go on these 10-day trips and things are incredible. It's almost like Disneyland for 10 days. And Israel is all those things. Israel is incredible. I love Israel. One of the weirdest tensions, I think, at this time for Jews in America is knowing how much safer I am in Irvine than Israel, and also so badly wanting to be in Israel. But one of the differences between, if you read Herzl and we start to delve into the philosophy of what Zionism was, Herzl was very pessimistic. Herzl, as the founder of political Zionism's whole reason for coming up with the modern political Zionist movement was based off of a deep-rooted pessimism of the entire nature of the rest of the world who aren't Jews. And this is a pretty stark view. And so just to read a little bit of what Herzl believed, because I actually think in times like this, when the Jewish community is vulnerable, and there is a sentiment of, why is everybody against us? Herzl's words ring very true, even though he's writing this about 130 years ago. So what Herzl writes, as he says, we have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It is not permitted to us. In vain we are loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and prosperity as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to enhance the fame of our native lands in the arts and sciences, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In our native lands, where we have lived for centuries, we are still decried as aliens, often by men whose ancestors had not yet come at a time when Jewish sighs had long been heard in the country. What Herzl's fundamental philosophy was, and this isn't a time to nitpick, right? There's a lot of reasons why Herzl might have been correct, a lot of reasons why Herzl might have been incorrect with his diagnosis. Herzl believed that anti-Semitism was an essential condition of the world, and that no matter what Jews had tried to do in living in any other country, right? For Herzl, he was looking at Christian lands and, well, anti-Semitism there. He was looking at Muslim lands. Well, anti-Semitism there. He was looking at secular lands, right? Let's talk about Nazism. Anti-Semitism there. Let's turn to communistic lands. Well, anti-Semitism there. Let's turn to even countries that were liberal democracies in the 20th century. Oh, anti-Semitism there. All of a sudden, America, when Jews need it most, closes their borders to Jews. And Herzl's diagnosis, again, whether or not Herzl's right or wrong, this is the dominant ethos that went into the foundation of the state of Israel. Herzl felt, well, okay, if there's nothing that we can do, right? If no amount of activism, no amount of being loyal citizens to France, to Germany, to Poland, to wherever Jews were living in Europe at the time, then Jews have to take our own safety into our own hands. And that is why Herzl decided that Jews so badly needed a state. It wasn't because of any positive values of, well, it's going to be great. We're going to be able to have these 10-day trips. Students are going to love it. We get to ride camels and eat falafel, right? Herzl Zionism was actually built out of a deep-rooted pessimism about the state of the world vis-a-vis Jews. And one of the greatest ironies that I personally find And I felt this way before at other times in Israel's history where there's been acts of terror. And of course, you get the usual, I mean, the last big one that I think I remember being in a Temple Beth Tikva class a little bit over 2.5 years ago was in 2021 in May, when there was the last sort of major flare up with Gaza. And of course, the anti-Semitic comments start to proliferate on social media and Twitter and all of these places, is that to some extent, the virulent anti-Semitism that's born out whenever there's an attack on Israel is itself a proof of concept for the need of Zionism in the first place. So just to say that again, rather than dissuade people who are Zionists, people who see the need for a Jewish state, people who see the need for a Jewish army, whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to skip ahead there, people who see the need for a Jewish army, a Jewish state, and all of that, rather than dissuade people like that whenever something like this happens and there's a proliferation of anti-Semitism, for me personally, it's actually a proof of concept. I actually feel, okay, now I really understand what Herzl's saying. Thank God for the last 30 years. Yes, there was a second intifada, right? That was a terrible time, but generally for the last 18 years of Israel's history, things have been nice. Things have been mostly peaceful. Obviously, there's been attacks here and there, but all of a sudden when something bad happens, right, it gets us right back into what sadly, and I'm not happy I'm about to say this next sentence, but what sadly the dominant thrust of Jewish history, where has its times of success and its times of horrific anti-Semitism and horrific violence against the Jewish community. And again, we don't have to recount all of the anti-Semitism throughout history, but the difference between other times in Jewish history when Jews were attacked and now is that we have a state, we have an army, and we know that yes, it is terrible. Yes, people were killed. Yes, it is a tragedy. And also the Jewish community globally and in Israel is going to be okay. Because now it's not, if we could only convince the most 100 powerful people in the world to care about Jews in Israel, then we'll be safe. We don't have to convince anybody. And so as sad as it is to say that, and it's not really my personal philosophy, just as an aside, right? You know, in 2 weeks from now, I'll be back to my normal scheduled, liberal demeanor of, no, actually, we can't create a liberal democracy where everybody can live at peace, right? I'll be back to that in about 2 weeks. But from where I am now, right, I sort of have the Herzl screaming in my ear saying, okay, what else can we expect vis-a-vis the rest of the world? This is why I did the thing in the first place. So that's just a little bit of a philosophy of Zionism off of my chest. The last thing I'll say here, because I have been hearing from a lot of students and also a lot of Temple Beth Tikva community members that I've had the pleasure of talking with, and a lot of people are asking very nuanced questions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about Israel's policy vis-a-vis people in Gaza, about all of the things that we're probably seeing on the news, depending on what news sources we're looking at. And for me personally, and I think what's important as we're about to study some of the nuances of the history, is that all of these questions are almost secondary questions. And so I'm a Zionist fundamentally because I believe Jews have the right to our own self-determination, and that takes the form of a state and an army. Any other questions after that, questions of should there be religion in the public sphere? What should the Western Wall look like? What rights should Palestinians have? Should Israel be condemned if they commit human rights violations in Gaza, right? All of those questions that we can and should discuss and paint the nuance, those are all secondary questions that, again, are important. But at the end of the day, I think the dominant philosophy of Zionism can't necessarily be based in everything Israel does is perfect, and that's why we love Israel, and it's the most moral country in the world. It has to be based on a much more fundamental premise of global picture of how the world works, global picture of how Jews have been treated in the world, and the idea that all peoples have a right, again, to their own protection. So, okay. And introduction on Zionism. If anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to, if it's relevant to everybody, unmute. If not, type it in the chat. I would love to hear what you think. And at the end, we'll take some time for group conversation, but I really did want to start off with Gaza in particular, because again, I think what I can provide that's the most helpful is not play-by-play news alerts. Everybody here hopefully has a variety of news sources that they're seeing, but probably the question that everybody's asking is, what is the history of this place? Why Gaza? What's been happening? Who is Hamas? So to start at the beginning, because everything we do with Israel has to have a biblical origin. And so for those that are familiar with a lot of the stories in the Tanakh, Gaza is a frequently talked about city all throughout the Hebrew Bible. And Gaza is, of course, this coastal city in the southwest part of Israel. Here is a zoomed in picture. This is obviously the modern cities, but just so you can see how small Gaza is. Gaza is about between 20 and 25 miles long and about 2 miles wide, or maybe 3 miles wide. So just so we're understanding, we are dealing with an area that is smaller than the drive from UC Irvine to Cal State Fullerton in terms of what we're talking about in geographical regions here. And this area took on not just importance in the modern day Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not just importance for the Six-Day War, but if one goes back to our stories in the books of Judges, in the books of Samuel, in the books of Kings, in the Tanakh, Gaza is all over the place. Probably the most famous story in Gaza from the Tanakh is the story of Samson. And that's the story of Samson, who was the really strong man, who was a Nazarite, who ends up going to battle against the Philistines. He eventually gets tricked by a woman named Delilah. She cuts his hair. He loses his power. And in one last act of, depending on the commentators, right, here's where the good Jewish debate gets in, depending on either on an act of heroism or an act of savagery, Samson ends up bringing down a Philistine temple and killing hundreds of Philistines in the ancient city of Gaza. But the reason why Gaza is such an important city in the ancient world and why it continues to be an important city is the same reason why Israel is an important geographic place in history in general. If you want to connect Africa to Asia, which in the ancient world was the primary commerce hub, almost the only way safely to do it is via Gaza. So imagine traveling from anywhere in the African world, right? We know ancient Egypt was one of the biggest empires in the world. We also know that Assyria and Babylonia were also the other ancient empires. And the one place that's right in between is, yes, the entire land of Israel, but to get into the land of Israel, you have to go through Gaza. Gaza is almost the doormat, so to speak, inside and outside of Israel. Because obviously one could try to travel through the Negev, but for those that have ever had the pleasure of visiting either the Sinai or the Negev, it is all desert. And so if you are going to go on weeks-long journeys in the ancient world, it's very hard to do that in the middle of a desert, especially because there's no reliable water sources. Even today, there's a reason why people in Israel, for the most part, choose not to live in the Negev and choose to live in the north. So you can imagine why, if you are a merchant in the ancient world, you don't want to go through the Negev. You don't want to spend 3 months wandering the desert, right? The Israelites with Moses were stuck in that desert for 40 years, right? So it's not a very easy desert to navigate. You're going to want to go through Gaza because you stay close to the coast. The temperatures are much cooler than the arid desert. There's more natural water sources and everything like that. So Gaza becomes a crucial place in the ancient world. And then, of course, because it is the doormat, it is also a hugely strategic defense site. And so again, think ancient empires. Gaza is a perfect place to have a huge military base and everything like that, because again, it is the entryway and exitway of Africa, the entryway and exitway of Asia. It is on the coast, so it can be used as a port city. And so Gaza really ends up being one of the central points of, again, the wider Hebrew Bible. And there's a reason why, again, for those who comb the Tanakh carefully, there's constant battles going back and forth, right? I mentioned before the story of Samson, which is the most famous one. So we're going to skip about 3,000 years. So sorry, we don't have time to fill in all of the history. But that gets us to the origins of the Gaza Strip as being a separate area than the rest of Israel. So we're probably all familiar with a very generalized history of the land of Israel. Of course, for about 400 years before World War I, it would have been a part of the Ottoman Empire. The Gaza Strip had no particular significance as a part of the Ottoman Empire. It was just one such area in the empire. When the British Mandate took over that area after World War I, Gaza was just a part of the British Mandate. Again, there was nothing particularly unique about the geographical location. And then all of a sudden, we get to the UN partition plan in 1947, when the UN finally gives Israel permission to declare a state. And probably a lot of people here are familiar with this map. After the UN goes in 1948 and has their experts combing the land, they decide this is what the future Jewish state in the blue, this is what the future Arab state or Palestinian state in the orange should look like. And of course, Gaza and a little bit of the Negev is included there because just geographically, that's where a lot of Palestinians anyway happen to live. And so again, the UN partition plan was attempted to, one of the reasons why this map is so funky, and one of the reasons why anybody who's never heard of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the two-state solution takes one look at this map and says, no wonder why they've been fighting for 80 years and that this hasn't worked in terms of a two-state solution. It was because when the UN went there, populations of humans don't just neatly settle in straight lines, right? If we were to map out population charts of, let's say, Southern California, of which ethnic groups live where, it would also seem like a random patchwork, right? People don't say, I'm only going to live on the Scottish street, and then next we'll have the Persian street, and then that'll be the neighborhood, right? Humans do a little bit, but not totally. And so the UN tried to, again, smartly divide it up so that each group would be happy with their own state in a place that they already had dominant population. Obviously, we know that in 1948, there was the War of Independence. During the War of Independence, Israel ended up conquering more land than the UN allotted for it in the defensive war. And this map on the right, once everything calmed down after 1948, Israel and the surrounding countries signed the Armistice Agreement in 1949. And all of a sudden, we have the map of Israel that would be the map for the next, I'm trying to do math really quickly, for the next 18 years until 1967. And again, this blue area is Gaza. And just one other important thing, this was at a time where there was complete chaos and anarchy to some extent in the Middle East once the UN partition plan was rejected. And during the Independence War, one of the things that we know happened is immediately overnight, the second Israel was declared, the day after, or probably later that day, all of the surrounding countries immediately declare war on Israel. And they don't just declare war because they hate Israel or because they hate Jews and because they thought the entire region had to be Arab. That was certainly part of it. But also, these were newly formed countries, right? The idea of nationalism in the Middle East was somewhat new. And all of these newly fledged countries just wanted more land, right? If you are the leader of a country throughout history, usually your goal, all things being equal, was how much can I grow my land, right? We see many examples in the world today. And so we know Jordan and Syria and Egypt coming from the various directions. After everything calmed down, it's not like these countries turned to the Palestinians and said, okay, let's figure out, right, how to have some sort of long-term solution. A lot of these countries ended up just taking the land for themselves. And so we know the West Bank becomes a part of Jordan. Jordan immediately overnight annexes the West Bank and makes the West Bank a part of Jordan, right? Syria ends up taking the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip is now under Egypt's control. Now you'll notice I switched my terminology a little bit because famously or infamously, Egypt did not want to annex the Gaza Strip. Egypt took control over it, but Egypt did not want to annex the Gaza Strip. And so we get to our first big question, right, to start to paint why the situation right now is so stark and quite honestly tragic for the Palestinians that are there, because Egypt takes over the Gaza Strip and Egypt does not want to offer citizenship to the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that were living in Gaza at the time. Because at this point, after the dust settles on this map on the right, it's not just all of the Palestinians who were already living in Gaza that ended up in Gaza. If we compare the map on the left to the map on the right, as the land that Arabs were on shrunk in comparison to land that Israel was on, there were tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, depending on your count, of Palestinian refugees who fled to the closest area that they viewed as outside of the newly formed Jewish state, which was Gaza. So Gaza is getting flooded by refugees, and Egypt wants the land for a lot of the reasons we talked about in terms of its strategy, and even just so Egypt can boast, oh, our country is now X amount of miles or kilometers bigger. Egypt does not want to offer any citizenship because, well, why should they, right? Nobody's going to force them. It's inconvenient to a country to absorb hundreds of thousands of refugees. So let's just leave them in Gaza. We'll keep control over the area. And not only did Egypt not offer citizenship, Egypt's policy vis-a-vis the Arabs or Palestinians that were living in the Gaza Strip is they're not allowed to leave. And so at that point, the border with Israel was sealed because it is a hot border, right? Israel and Egypt were still at war after 1948. Israel and Egypt would fight about 5 more wars until we made peace with Egypt in 1979. And so that border was sealed in the north, and Egypt did not allow anybody to come in from the Gaza Strip into Egypt. And so already from 1949, the Arab population that was living in Gaza was quite literally trapped in this small area that, again, we just said was about 25 miles by 5 miles. This is not a big area. And so Egypt's policy, again, towards the Gaza Strip was one based solely off of course, selfishness and not really caring. And this is sadly a common theme, right? We can, if we were talking about the West Bank and, Jordan's policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians in the West Bank and everything that happened there in the 60s and 70s and 80s, right? We can tell a similar story. A couple more important things. So between 1948 and 1967, and then I'll take some questions for people just to clarify. The area was being flooded with refugees in 1949 that we discussed. That population, understandably, was getting increasingly radicalized, really against everybody, because they were locked in an area. And because of, again, here's where some nuance sets in. So here are the 2 different narratives that I'll just say. I won't say which one I think is more correct. Either because, and usually they can both be a little bit correct, either because in the Arab world, there was still constant propaganda against the Jewish state, constant anti-Semitic ideas about who Jews were, the constant feeling, especially from Egypt, Egypt was still in this wave in the 1920s, 30s, and it really lasted through the 40s and 50s a little bit of pan-Arab nationalism, meaning the heads of Egypt in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, their goal for the Middle East was to have just a wider confederate of Arab areas that were united under one ruler that, of course, well, once it's my idea, I'll just be the ruler. So it was going to be led by the president of Egypt. And so Egypt's policy, again, was we want to conquer the entire Middle East, pan-Arab nationalism. And if you're trying to unite all the other nations under one banner of nationalism, you probably don't care much for Palestinian nationalists, of whom some started to grow in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. At the same time, Israel's policy towards that border was one, of course, of closely shut. Israel and Egypt had a number of skirmishes in the 1950s called the War of Attrition. It was just a series of back and forth skirmishes along Suez. And all of this was creating worse and worse conditions for the Palestinians that were living in Gaza, because they were boxed in on borders on all sides, from Israel because of the border with Egypt, from Egypt because they didn't want to deal with Palestinians. And so this started to radicalize some of the population. And there were groups of people called the Fedayeen, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, who were nationalistic terrorists. And so when I say nationalistic terrorists, I mean these were people that came from Gaza that were not particularly religious. One of the interesting things actually about the wider Arab world in the middle of the 20th century is that it was actually pretty secular. We tend to think that because there's so much Islamism within the Middle East, we tend to think that, okay, well, also in 1940 and 1950, it must have been that all the most powerful and most violent actors in the Middle East were always these Islamic fundamentalist militants. Early on, during the wave of Egyptian nationalism, there was a lot of secular and even socialistic policies throughout the Arab world. And so you start to have this group that appears in Egypt called the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood starts off actually as quite a peaceful group in the 1950s and 1960s. And the Muslim Brotherhood's view, and I'll take the thoughts. So yeah, I see Gabe saying Zionism was also a secular movement for the most part. 100%, right? Zionism was also a socialistic national movement, very similar to how Nasser and Egypt's policy was socialist and secular, and also many Palestinians in terms of their early nationalism, and the PLO was nationalistic and socialistic. And so you start to have the Muslim Brotherhood pop up in Egypt. And the Muslim Brotherhood started off as actually a very peaceful organization. And the Muslim Brotherhoods, if you take the name literally, the Muslim Brotherhood was there to spread Islam, right? Peaceful Islam among an increasingly socialistic and secular Egyptian world that they felt, isn't it sad that all of our young people no longer grow up with the teachings of Islam? We should set up centers around Egypt, and we should try to teach people the beauty in Islam, right? Not dissimilar to what Jewish groups do today in terms of, right, the American Jewish community, in terms of, synagogues and other groups, right, for the first couple of years of Muslim Brotherhood. But the difference is, very quickly, Egypt is not a liberal democracy where it's all nice and well to have a synagogue set up, even if the dominant culture is secular. And so Egypt starts cracking down very heavily on the Muslim Brotherhood. And so the Muslim Brotherhood, because of Egypt's cracking down, and when I say cracking down, I don't just mean, they got a slap on the wrist. Egypt's policy at times towards people who were spreading religion as a socialist country was pretty bad, right? Egypt was not afraid to use physical violence, force, torture, right? Anything we can imagine against anybody who were upsetting it, and especially the Muslim Brotherhood. And so you have this group that starts to get more and more radicalized and more religious. This then takes us, again, just to this wider area, right? Just to review, I totally should have flipped slides here, right? Palestinians in Gaza, right, between 49 and 67, because of Egypt, had no citizenship, no movement. And this next point is even more important. Because Egypt didn't want to deal with the Muslim Brotherhood, their policy towards the Muslim Brotherhood was, let's just get these people far away from us. How do you get people far away from us? Oh, it turns out we just came into this new land strip called the Gaza Strip. There's a bunch of people there who are under our control, but they aren't citizens. We don't really care much for them. We have this other group of people, the Muslim Brotherhood, who are becoming increasingly radicalized and difficult to deal with. Let's just move prisoners from the Muslim Brotherhood. We'll toss them into Gaza. No one can get out of Gaza anyway, right? Border with Israel sealed, border with Egypt is sealed. And that way we don't have to deal with them, right? They'll just end up in Gaza and they'll just live there. What happens when you mix all that together, right? Of course, we're going to see soon that creates ripe conditions for very angry people who are very upset at basically the rest of the world. And so, as one could imagine, right, just connecting the obvious dots, the population of Gaza, who started off as Palestinians that were for the most part relatively secular, the population of Gaza becomes more religious and more Islamist aligned. And that's even true today, right? If anybody here has ever wondered why Palestinians in the West Bank tend to, on average, be less fundamentalist religious than Palestinians in Gaza, a lot of it is because of this early policy of Egypt of dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood and foisting them onto Gaza. And so this would have been the situation for the first 17, 18 years after Israel was founded. I see that Corral, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Why did the Muslim Brotherhood become radical? So it really took a while. And even during this entire period, between 1949 and 1967, the Muslim Brotherhood was not particularly radical in terms of their methods. And so they were very religious, right? You probably wouldn't have a great conversation about LGBT rights with them, right? I'm sure that's the case, but they weren't committing acts of terrorism in the name of Islam, the same as what we think of when we hear radical Islamist groups. That didn't start until really the 70s and really even the 80s. But they became increasingly conservative in terms of their religious views, right? At a certain point, it stopped being about, well, let's just try to spread Islam to everybody who accepts it, and you need to accept Islam, to if you don't accept Islam, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, right? And that's a similar transition. I mean, even just in the entire Islamic world, this is probably a little bit beyond the scope of both this class and even, if I'm totally honest, what I feel equipped to actually talk about with any authority. But in general, in the entirety of the Arab/Islamic world, you had a heightening religious conservatism throughout the 20th century, to a point where today there are probably more Muslims in the world that have what we would call Islamist philosophy than if we went back in time 100 years ago. And so, again, there are many scholars that know a ton more than anybody here about why that might be. Of course, there are competing views. The blame is tossed to any and all sides, right? That's beyond the scope. But the Muslim Brotherhood undergoes just a certain, a very, very much in that evolution of not religious to a little bit religious to everybody needs to adopt our religion. But it is a great question. So we now get to the part where probably most people here hopefully are not unfamiliar with, where in 1967, it becomes the most important war probably in Israel's history, but also for the Gaza Strip. And that is 1967, the Six-Day War. Just one story about the Six-Day War, because I heard it last night and it touched my heart a little bit. We were running a vigil for the events that just happened this past Saturday at UC Irvine, and it was beautiful. We had about 150 people, mostly students, but a couple of faculty came. And there was a faculty who came from, I believe, the biology department, and he was this older guy. And I'd met him a couple of times. Maybe I think he teaches in the med school or something. And he pulled me aside after the vigil, and he said, when I was 18, when I was in my freshman year of college at one of the UCs, that was when the Six-Day War broke out. And I remember so vividly, on the first night of the Six-Day War, our campus held a vigil for Israel, because at that time, people didn't know Israel was going to have the success that it ended up doing. There was real fear in the Jewish world that Israel was going to be wiped out leading up to the Six-Day War. And he said, that's actually what inspired me to have the rest of my life to be connected to Israel, this moment when I was 18. And he said, who knows of the students who came to the vigil on campus, who knows if they're going to be talking to people in 50 years also, 56 years also about the events here. So it was a really touching story. And we've all heard of the Six-Day War. We've all heard of the, I'll use the term miraculous, right? The miraculous victory that Israel had after being attacked from all sides. We know about the Golan Heights, we know about the West Bank, and we know about Gaza, and we know about the Sinai Peninsula. And so overnight, and really when I say overnight, I mean in the course of a week, Israel goes from this map on the left in the green to this map on the right. And so all of a sudden, Israel not just is confined to this tiny area, but Israel conquers the Golan Heights, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Sinai. And this is going to inform, obviously, all of Israeli geopolitics still today. And so this is the most important watershed event in Israel's history after the founding. And now, of course, Gaza overnight goes from being under Egyptian control, where the local population does not have citizenship, now under Israeli military control. And so what happens afterwards is the same thing that happened in the West Bank, right? So now for people who are familiar with generally the history of the West Bank, the next 20 to 30 years of Gaza looks very similar, with a couple of interesting differences. One, it just bears mentioning that Gaza, from the pictures I've seen, because I've never been to Gaza because Israel disengaged in 2005, so you have not been able to go there for the last 18 years. And when I visited Israel as a child, we never went into the Gaza Strip, but the pictures of Gaza are stunning. I mean, and the people who live there described it as one of the most beautiful places in the entirety of the Middle East. I mean, here's just a picture I found. I believe this picture was watermarked from the 1970s. Again, don't trust everything you see on the internet, but Gaza is an absolutely beautiful place. And so after 1967, just like what we saw happen in the West Bank, Gaza saw an increase of what we call settlements. What is a settlement, right? Just a brief history. A settlement is, going back to this map, any land that Israel did not have before 1967, and that after 1967, Israel did not annex, is a settlement. So Jews living in the Golan Heights is not considered a settlement, because Israel has annexed the Golan Heights, and Israel has adopted that into its country. Laws apply equally in the Golan Heights. Everybody that was living in the Golan Heights in 1967 or I believe it took a couple years after, eventually was offered citizenship. In the West Bank and Gaza, it was a very similar policy to what Egypt had, which was, we're going to rule over this area and we're not going to offer citizenship, because at that time, the dominant philosophy of the hundreds of thousands of people who were living in Gaza were staunch, mostly secular, but increasingly religious Palestinian nationalists who hated the state of Israel. And so, of course, Israel's policy is not going to be, okay, well, I have a great idea, let's offer citizenship. Like, again, people that have moral qualms with any and all of these decisions, these are fair things to argue about and debate about, and historians will probably debate about forever. But what we know in terms of the facts is Israelis started to move to this area. Settlements started to proliferate in the Gaza Strip, with one interesting caveat between why somebody would rather settle in the Gaza Strip than the West Bank. The West Bank, for all of us who are familiar with Jewish history, which I'm going to guess is almost everyone here, because I recognize almost everyone's faces from a 20-week Jewish history course that you were all in last year. So I'm going to guess that some of that information hopefully has stuck. The dominant stories of the Tanakh and the Torah take place in the West Bank, right? When we think about the Torah, we think about places like Hebron and Shechem and Beit Lechem and Jerusalem, right? These are the original Jewish places that our stories talk about. The Gaza Strip, interestingly enough, is actually not considered part of the biblical land of Israel. And so what I mean by that is, when the Torah or the wider Tanakh is describing the geography of what Israel is, and this ends up actually being a very important discussion for Jewish legal debates, because as we know, there are a lot of laws in Judaism that only apply to the land of Israel, that once you leave the land of Israel do not apply, right? We can name a couple, right? Most famously probably is Shemitah. So every 7 years, according to Jewish law, the land inside Israel is not allowed to be farmed, but land outside of Israel is allowed to be farmed, right? There are several other laws like that. And so Gaza is actually not part of Israel in terms of the biblical halachic sense, right? In terms of modern maps, right? You can say that Israel is whatever we want. And so it wasn't religious predominantly. It wasn't people who are moving for religious messianic reasons. It were people who were moving there, one, because it's beautiful, and two, because people who believed that it was important for Israeli security. So throughout 1970s, as a result of now the Israeli military occupation period over Gaza, there was another level of increased Palestinian national identity, right? Because again, at this point, the Palestinians in Gaza know and have probably all given up on ever becoming actually a part of Egypt. All of a sudden, they have nothing to do with Egypt anymore, because if you look at the map, the Sinai Desert is huge. And so they're completely geographically disconnected from Egypt, right? Israel is not going to give the Sinai back until 1979 in trade for peace with Egypt. And so you start to get this increased Palestinian national identity, which also coincides with, as one can understand, terrorist attacks done in the name of Palestinian national identity. And actually, just an interesting tidbit, I actually did not know this until this morning when I was doing a little bit of reading just to think about some of these different decades. 90% of the terrorist attacks that were perpetuated by Palestinian nationals in the 1970s was actually Palestinian on Palestinian terrorist attacks. And one of the reasons why was because before the first Intifada, so before 1987, there was generally a free flowing of movement from lands that were under Israeli military control to Israel proper. So I'm talking both the West Bank and Gaza. And so every morning, most Palestinians, if you wanted a higher income, let's say, you would get in your car, you would drive across, the small border into Israel, and you would spend your day working, and you would go home at the end of the day, and all would be great. All of a sudden now, once there's more and more nationalistic fervor, all of a sudden, some Palestinians are not happy that other Palestinians are normalizing Israel by driving a little bit north into the state of Israel. And so you start to get a lot of terrorist attacks. This picture on the bottom right is a fascinating picture, because this is a bus full of Palestinian workers that are going from Gaza into Israel proper. And there are a bunch of IDF jeeps around it to protect it from other Palestinians who might try to attack it. And so just to get a sense of tensions flaring already in the 1970s in this area, and this is not Israelis versus Arabs or Jews versus Palestinians or anything like that. These are of the Palestinian Gazans who lived in the Gaza Strip, disputes over how much should you associate with Israel, to the point where if some were working in the state of Israel, right, they would be at risk of attack. And this all boils over to what we know to be the first Intifada in 1987. And the first Intifada in 1987 was a uprising, as an Intifada is. It was not as violent as the second one, although it was still violent. But the first Intifada is usually thought of as the time where Palestinian national identity was really solidified. And so really Palestinians, right, it's unclear exactly when a distinctive Palestinian identity was truly solidified, right? Perhaps it was the 1920s. Other scholars say perhaps it wasn't until after 1948. Others say maybe it wasn't until after 1967. But already by 1987, we know that there was a concrete Palestinian national identity that, again, was contrary to Israeli or Zionistic identity. At the same time, and now we're getting to, the directly modern important part, Hamas is created in 1987. What is Hamas? Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So we talked about the Muslim Brotherhood, this group of ultra-religious Islamists who were pushed by Egypt into Gaza. Now Gaza is under Israeli control. The Muslim Brotherhood, again, generally did not involve themselves in politics until the first Intifada. After the first Intifada, the Muslim Brotherhood was looking around and they decided to say, hey, we need a military arm, right? We need a nationalistic arm to our dominant philosophy of not just by now spreading fundamentalist Islam, but also of creating Palestinian nationalism that, again, is directly opposed to any type of Jewish state or Jewish country. And so one of the unique facets of Hamas is, somebody asked me on campus the other day, is Hamas motivated by nationalism or by religion? And the answer is exactly both, right? And just like if somebody were to ask you, is Judaism a religion, an ethnicity, a nation, right? We all know that answer is complicated, right? It's only in the Western world that we've been able to neatly divide religion from nationalism, from politics, or all these things. In the Middle East, things are much more complicated. And so Hamas is motivated by both fundamentalist Islamism, right? The same way we can all think of other Islamist groups of the last several years, right? ISIS, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, all of these groups, and also strong nationalism that, again, has a Palestinian identity as distinct from Zionist or Israeli identity. And there was an additional need for Hamas to be created from the Muslim Brotherhood, because as a result of the first Intifada, it was primarily championed by the up-and-coming PLO, led by Yasser Arafat. The PLO was a secular organization. The PLO was a nationalistic Palestinian secular organization that was behind a lot of the first Intifada's uprising. And so if you're the Muslim Brotherhood, you're thinking, well, it seems like we're going to lose the crowd here, right? If the PLO are these big heroes that are standing up to big bad Israel, and we're just sitting here in the mosques trying to talk about how beautiful Islam is, or anything about Islam, we're going to lose everybody. So we need to enter into the political and nationalistic arena. And so again, Hamas is really born out of and during the first Intifada. Now to their charter, because this is the part where it seems like a lot of people are confused, especially, not anybody in this Zoom call, I'm sure, but the way people are talking about Hamas, and from what I've seen the last couple of days, a lot of people are saying, well, Hamas is really just the champion for the poor Palestinians that are living in Gaza, right? Hamas is really, right? What do you expect if you have, people that are kept in an open-air prison by Egypt and Israel and all of these things? To understand what Hamas's philosophy is, there was a really important article that I saw today in The Atlantic by Bruce Hoffman. I'm happy to send it around after. And so he links to 4 fundamental views of the Hamas charter. And rather than take his word for it, after I read this, I'll actually go to another screen and we'll read some of the primary source of the Hamas charter, because if somebody tells you what they believe and then they do an action that confirms that belief, you should probably believe them if they actually meant what they were talking about. So the charter of Hamas is generally split into 4 ideas. 1, the complete destruction of Israel as an essential condition for the liberation of Palestine and the establishment of a theocratic state based off of Sharia law. 2, the need for both unrestrained and unceasing holy war jihad to attain the above objection. 3, the deliberate disdain for and dismissal of any negotiated resolution or political settlement of Jews and Muslim claims to the Holy Land. And 4, the reinforcement of historical and anti-Semitic tropes and calamities married to sinister conspiracy theories. You might be sitting there thinking, well, how bad can these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories really be? And so just to see one example, let's see if I saved the right tab. I did not. And all give me 1 second. Pull it up. Gotten quite quick at pulling up the Hamas charter in the last couple of days, sadly. So if we look at the Hamas charter, right, just to pick an area, right, Article 22, this is the Hamas charter that is published for everybody to see it. Here is Article 22 of Hamas explaining why they do not like Jews. Hamas says, for a long time, the enemies, of course, are the Jews, have been planning skillfully and with precision for the achievement of what they attained. They took into consideration the causes affecting the current of events. They strive to amass great and substantial material wealth, which they devoted to the realization of their dreams. With their money, they took control of the world media, news agencies, the press, publishing houses, broadcasting stations, and others. With their money, they stirred revolutions in various parts of the world with the purpose of achieving their interests and reaping the fruits therein. They were behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and most of the revolutions we have heard about here and there. With their money, they formed secret societies such as the Freemasons, Rotary Clubs, and Lions, and others in different parts of the world for the purpose of sabotaging societies and achieving Zionist interests. With their money, they were able to control imperialistic countries and instigate them to colonize many countries in order to enable them to exploit their resources and spread corruption there. You may speak as much as you want about regional and world wars. They were behind World War I, when they were able to destroy the Islamic Caliphate, making financial gains and controlling resources. They obtained the Balfour Declaration, formed the League of Nations, through which they can rule the world. They were behind World War II, through which they made huge financial gains by trading in armaments. They paved the way for the establishment of their state. It was they who instigated the replacement of the League of Nations with the UN and the Security Council to enable them to rule the world through them. There is no war going on anywhere without having their finger in it. So just to get a sense of, this seems like we've moved on a lot, right? I see a lot of people shaking their head. If you never heard that before, sorry that it was so abrupt, but again, sadly, we have to take these ideas seriously because they clearly are motivating people to act in the world today, right? This is not an organization that seems particularly interested with the nuances of social justice, of ensuring that a population that doesn't get as much food as they probably should, to increase a little bit of food, right? This is the dominant charter of Hamas starting in 1988 when they put this out. I will say, just because it's important to note for the historical record, and it's important to note just because it is also making the rounds in articles. In 2017, so this was the Hamas charter from 1988 to 2017. In 2017, Hamas came out with an updated charter where Hamas changed all of their hatred for Jews into Zionists. And so they, sort of control search, Jew replaced with Zionist, right? And a couple other big changes that they did. Now, again, there's 2 ways to look at this. This time I will tell you which way I think, right? One way to look at this is Hamas learned, and Hamas is trying to become more peaceful. And Hamas realized that, the error in their ways, they went to Shul on Yom Kippur. And after, the Ashamnu Bagadnu, right, they realized, like, woe is us, we've done all this, right? The other way, which is what I think and what most scholars of terrorism think, is Hamas saw and understood that social justice and leftist organizations in the Western world were starting to see Israel-Palestine not as a religious war and not as everything we've just talked about before with all the nuances, but started seeing it through the lens of colonialism and anti-colonialism and all of this. And so Hamas very wisely changed their charter in a way that if you are a radical social justice centric group, you can read that charter and you could say, well, yeah, right. They're not anti-Semitic. They're just talking about Zionists, right? They're not anti-what? They're just talking about this. Even though what terrorism experts will say is they didn't actually change any of their tactics. So it's not that after 2017, they changed the way that they act and run the Gaza Strip, right? So it's almost, Maimonides says, if you do teshuvah, it's not actually considered teshuvah until you change your actions, right? You can say, I regret what I did, all I want, right? The Hamas's charter sort of seems to be like that. And so from 1967, right, just to continue on our history, right, Hamas is founded. And a couple of years after Hamas is founded, probably as a result of the first Intifada, we know it was the famous Oslo Accords, where Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat sat down and they came up with a pathway to a two-state solution and to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is 1993, so about 30 years ago. And under the Oslo Accords, right, in the West Bank, right, it ends up being very complex in terms of who is in control of what, right? We'll probably save that for another class. But most of Gaza was taken from being under direct Israeli rule and handed to the Palestinian Authority, right? One of the big things that happened during the Oslo Accords was that the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO, that became the PA, it was seen by Israel as a terrorist organization throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Yitzhak Rabin, one of the things that he did in the Oslo Accords was normalize the Palestinian Authority and say, if we're going to make peace, if we're going to have a two-state solution, we have to stop seeing the movement for Palestinian nationalism as terrorists. We have to start taking them seriously as a government. And so part of Oslo, again, what everyone here thinks about Oslo, was legitimizing and normalizing the PA. And so as a part of that, Israel says, well, okay, start to rule over Gaza. Over the next couple of years, Israel ends up constructing a big barrier between Israel proper and Gaza. At the same time, in 1996, there are widespread elections. The PA holds their elections, and Hamas boycotts the elections of the Palestinian Authority because Hamas is upset because the Palestinian Authority 3 years ago normalized Israel. And so again, if your charter is based off of the Jews are the problem for all calamities in the history of the world, and they have no right to anything, and the Zionists are terrible, and we need to kill all of them, and all of a sudden, the head of the election committee is interacting with Israel and normalizing them, the Hamas member said, okay, we're going to boycott the election. And understandably, Fatah, who is the party now that's ruling the West Bank, ends up winning a landslide victory. This situation continues with Fatah in control for the next couple of years. Then in the year 2000, we have another attempted peace talks. The peace talks collapse. That ends up leading to the Second Intifada. This is a horrific time in Israel's history. Although I should note, the Second Intifada, a couple things about it, started in 2000. Some of my personal earliest memories growing up were the Second Intifada, because I have a lot of family that lives in Israel, and I actually visited Israel. My family was one of the few American families that I think continued to visit Israel during the craziness and danger that was the Second Intifada, when pizza parlors were blowing up, coffee shops were blowing up, suicide bombers. What's crazy and really horrific is the death toll from Saturday was around the same, if not greater, than the entirety of the Second Intifada put together. So just to get a magnitude of how big and how tragic the attack on Saturday was, this 5 years of horrific onslaughts of terrorism coming into Israel in the early 2000s, one day was more deadly than that. But we know as a result of the Second Intifada, there was another layer of increased security, right? And now we get into this cat and mouse game, or this chicken and egg game that, again, is morally complicated, right? I don't want to sugarcoat the moral complications in Israeli policy, because there's always going to be somewhat of a zero-sum game between security and freedom, right? To take an extreme example, if America hired 100 million policemen, and at every single 100 feet on public sidewalks, there was a police standing there, and every time you walked anywhere, you had to walk through a metal detector, and all of our phones were being tapped by the government. In some sense, we would, assuming that government is good and has our best interests in mind, right? That's a big assumption, but let's assume that's true, right? We would all be safer, right? The risk of there being active shooters in public would go down. The risk of somebody robbing your house would go down. But probably most of us are not taking that because we also like having freedom, right? We don't want to be patted down in a metal detector every time we go to a grocery store. At least I personally don't. And so you get these really tough moral questions of how much do you raise security versus how much do you lower freedom? And especially in a place like Israel, especially after the Second Intifada, Israel was faced with these big morally complex questions. I don't believe there's one right answer to it, of how much do you crack down on freedom of movement and freedom of speech and freedom of gathering for Palestinians, or how much do you say, no, actually, because of security concerns, we need to put more checkpoints, more surveillance, more of these things. Again, that's a difficult question for another time. But as a result of the Second Intifada, right, again, security infrastructures proliferate in Gaza. Gaza ends up being just an absolute mess during the Second Intifada. For those who remember reading the reports, we know that's when Hamas and another Palestinian group called Islamic Jihad, right, we're not really going to focus on them, they start launching rockets into Israel. These are the first of the rockets that, of course, by now we're very familiar with. In 2002, Israel destroys Hamas infrastructure in the West Bank. In 2003, Israel kills the head of Hamas. Now, this ends up being the turning point both for Israel and Hamas, because after the heads of Hamas are killed, it seems like Hamas has very little military strength left. And so Hamas ends up pivoting again and ends up joining the Palestinian Authority. And so Hamas, right, does what a lot of groups in history do, which is if you can't get your way with direct violence, let's join politics, right? If you can't do what you want to do with physical force, write to your congressperson, right? Hamas did this, right, times 100. And so Hamas ends up joining the PA elections, which are going to be very important after, sorry for the switching of the timeline here. I didn't have enough time to neatly put this into bullet points because I ended up spending longer on campus than I thought I would. But probably the most important event that happens after this, and I believe this is actually the second to last slide. Okay, good. So we are almost finished. We can have some conversation. In 2005, after a result of the Second Intifada, Israel understandably has had enough. There's only about 9,000 settlers from Israel that are living in Gaza at this time for a whole variety of other reasons that historians will continue to debate for eternity. Ariel Sharon, who is a very right-wing Likud leader in Israel, for those who are familiar with Menachem Begin, Ariel Sharon was Menachem Begin's protege and the same political party that Benjamin Netanyahu is part of. So this is not the liberal or left-wingism of labor that did this. This is the hard-headed rightness of the revisionist camp and of the Likud camp. Ariel Sharon decides to disengage from Gaza. And that means overnight, pulling out not just about 10,000 Israelis that were living there. And you can see on YouTube, again, this wasn't so long ago, videos of the IDF coming in and forcibly removing Israelis from Gaza. But also all military forces were withdrawn, and Ariel Sharon gives Gaza over to the PA and says, here, this is now for you to rule over. Now, again, historians will endlessly debate about why Ariel Sharon did this. Did Ariel Sharon do this because he thought it was a pathway to peace? Maybe. Did Ariel Sharon do this because after the Second Intifada, it was too big of a risk for Israeli soldiers to patrol in Gaza? Maybe. Did Ariel Sharon do this because at the time there was about 1 million to 1.5 million Palestinians living in Gaza, maybe even more, according to some accounts, and anyway, there's a wider population crisis in terms of what the wider population of the entire area of the ancient land of Israel, maybe, right? So there's all different reasons as to why Ariel Sharon might have done this, but he did it. He hands over Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. They hold elections. All of a sudden, there's a convergence of all the factors we've been talking about. Hamas joins the election. The population's more radicalized. The population's more religious. All of these things. Hamas, as, again, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, has been spending the last 30 or 40 years in Gaza, not just, again, inciting people against violence, Hamas also runs food banks. Hamas also helps take care of widows. Hamas also, right? All of the things that you would expect a religious group that's living in the community to do, right? It's not that they weren't doing this. And so a lot of the people look to Hamas and they vote in Hamas and they say, hey, we want you to represent us. So Hamas gets elected into leading Gaza in 2006. And the UN immediately requires Hamas to accept all past peace agreements. Hamas refuses. Again, they are not going to ever agree to peace with Israel. And so the UN cuts off aid. And so all of a sudden now Hamas is starved for resources because they're not getting aid from Israel, not getting it from Egypt, not getting it from the UN, and chaos breaks. As it says here in my notes, right, there was an attempt to create a unity government with Fatah, but at the end of the day, Hamas gets so upset that Hamas goes on a murderous rampage in 2007, completely shirking any political system. Again, Gaza, at least in 2005, attempted to be somewhat of a democracy. They had an election. Hamas was elected in. Hamas, once they took control, they abolished all electoral processes and they took Fatah members, right, of the opposing party, and they either killed them or somehow sent them to the West Bank. And so in 2007, Hamas ends up taking over. And then we get into the modern history. We know that in 2008, there were frequent attacks by Hamas on Israelis. And so Israel is forced to now go and bomb Gaza. We know that this continues, right, back and forth, right? And now we get into the cycle that's, I mean, truly horrific. Again, just because something's horrific, just because a tragic event happened on Saturday doesn't mean we can't take a step back and view the last 15 years. And again, with all of this context, it's still really sad. It's not, of course, right? History does not neatly converge on, well, here's exactly who's to blame, right? The history here is very messy with all the different actors. And every couple of years, right? 2008, there was another one in 2012. There was another conflict in 2014. I lived in Israel for many of these conflicts. There was another in 2018. There was another big one in 2021. Every couple of years, Hamas either shoots rockets into Israel, right? Barrages of rockets every couple of years, right? Also, there's been two big wars because Hamas has dug a extensive system of tunnels underground into Israel. And so all this time, again, we get into this terrible cycle of chicken and egg with Hamas launching terrorist attacks. As a result, Israel is forced to bomb and also destroy infrastructure of rocket launch sites and tunnels. As a result, and also blockade, right? So not allow resources in, because sadly, one of the things that we know early on is that Hamas was taking a lot of the money that was sent to it and using it to build terrorist infrastructure. As a result, the people in the people in Gaza are starved. They have no resources. Unemployment rate in 2021 was above 50%. I don't think that's possible for a society to live with an unemployment rate at above 50%. Hamas is considered one of the densest populated places on earth. So I believe, I don't remember where I saw this fact, so take it with a grain of salt, but 3 or 4 times the population density of Manhattan. So just in terms of what we're talking about, people are living on top of each other. Hamas also, this is well documented, right? New York Times, Washington Post, reputable journalists. Hamas also uses, of course, human shields. And what I mean by human shields is specifically builds rocket launch sites from civilian infrastructure, such as hospitals and elementary schools. Because again, they understand that this is not just a military war, this is also an informational war. And so Israel is forced oftentimes with this very sticky question of, what do you do? Now, has Israel policy towards Gaza been good, bad, awful, immoral, moral over the last 20 years, right? That's a personal question. I'm honestly not sure. I mean, we can roll back the dice. It's unclear exactly what one could have done in any different situations. It's also worth mentioning that even if one thinks that no, Israel actually really messed up in terms of its Gaza policy, Egypt also has the exact same policy towards Gaza. And so anybody who's saying that Israel has the sole blame for starving Gazans to a point of radicalization, Egypt is doing the exact same thing in terms of their blockade, if not even worse. because when ISIS was making their way through the Middle East, there was times where it seemed like Hamas and ISIS were going to link up. And we know that this extensive network of tunnels was also not only being built from Gaza into Israel, but also being built in the south from Gaza into Egypt. Egypt, at some point, I believe it was a couple of years ago, you can look it up, went in, carpet bombed hundreds of meters of area on its border, and then went in, destroyed all the tunnels with no regard for anybody there, for houses, for civilian populations. And so Egypt's policy also historically towards Gaza has been absolutely terrible. At the same time, and this will be the last thing I say about the history of Gaza, just to see some statistics from 2001 here, in terms of the last couple of years, and one of the things that I think will be the subject of a lot of analysis in the next 100 years, because this is what happened Saturday was one of the biggest events in Israel's history by far. And so I was telling, I you know, in between my shock and my tears and, you know, just horror on Shabbat morning, once I found out about what had happened, I turned to Shayna and I was like, what's the date today? And she like looks at me weird. She's like, it's October 7th. Why? And I'm like, because October 7th is going to have the same meaning as 9/11 for the rest of our lives in terms of the way that we think about history and the way that we think about Israel. And so, right, on a normal Saturday, I'm not worried about what date it is, but I'm never going to forget, you know, October 7th, 2023. One of the things that I think we're going to be seeing a lot of in the next couple of weeks and months is people talking about what Bibi's policy towards the Gaza Strip has been over the last 10 years. And here's where things, right, this is a little bit more political analysis than I probably wanted to give, but I already started talking, so I might as well finish. One of the things that a lot of people have criticized Benjamin Netanyahu for is Benjamin Netanyahu's policy towards Gaza and Hamas has been one of very much not taking any drastic steps to destroy Hamas. Now, a lot of people here might be shocked because Bibi Netanyahu positions himself as the Mr. Security and the person who has Israel's best interest in mind and everything like that. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. Again, I'm not here to give my personal opinion about Bibi, but we know that over the last 10, 15 years, it's been Iran through Qatar that's funneled Gaza most of its money. And Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government has basically known that this is happening and has allowed money to flow freely, mostly from Qatar to Gaza, because Hamas, before this past Saturday, was to a large extent, from a specific point of view, this is not my view, but from some Israeli point of view, a stabilizing force. As long as Hamas existed, they were in control of the people in Gaza. Israel didn't have to worry about it. Even more so, because they're a terrorist organization, Israel didn't have to worry about any moral claims towards the people in Gaza. A lot of people who talk about the nuances of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict generally focus a lot more about the Palestinians in the West Bank than they do about Gaza. And that's because Israel can say for the last 10, 15 years, what can we do with Gaza? There's a terrorist group running it. And so one of the things that actually internal in Israeli politics, because for everybody on the Zoom call that I'm sure has been paying attention to the last year of internal Israeli political turmoil, one of the things in which Bibi Netanyahu has been attacked for time and time again in the last couple of election cycles has been his Gaza policy. And it turns out, and again, there's going to be hundreds of books written about this, and you know, in 50 years, I'm still going to be teaching about this, hopefully. There's going to be a lot of introspection as to what happened and why Israel didn't know that this happened, why there was no intelligence, why Israel didn't seem prepared for this. There's some rumors that there might have been an Iranian spyware attack at the same time. I was just listening and reading a report earlier, about an hour ago, that said that in Gaza, they've captured drone footage of full training sites that look like Israeli villages. So when the Hamas militants can get into Israel, they would know how to navigate cities. I mean, this was an intricately done attack. And how Israel, who has the best cybersecurity and surveillance in the world, was not able to capture this, that's going to be a big question. Maybe it's because the government was too distracted by internal politics. Maybe it's because the government now really didn't have security at the top of mind. This government made up of ultra-Orthodox ultra-nationalists and Benjamin Netanyahu all had their own interests, right? Ultra-Orthodox were focused on more money for ultra-Orthodox institutions. Ultra-nationalists were concerned with building more settlements in the West Bank, and Benjamin Netanyahu was worried about getting out of jail. Again, that's all political commentary, but these are some of the theories that are being put forth. Because again, just as one point in comparison, this will be the last thing I say. One of the big reckonings in Israeli political history was after the Yom Kippur War, which was exactly 50 years before Saturday. And for those that are historians that know Israel's history, the Yom Kippur War is noted as, before this war, the worst singular day or set of days in Israel's history in terms of Israel not paying enough attention to intelligence, perhaps Israel being a little bit too cocky after the victory of the Six-Day War. But in 1973, Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan and the Labor government seemed to completely drop the ball in terms of Israeli security. And the Labor Party has never recovered politically from that. Israelis for the past 50 years have viewed the left as synonymous with, this is the weak party. This is the Labor Party that allowed the Yom Kippur War to happen. And so there's going to be somewhat of a similar reckoning. And we have no idea what Israeli politics are going to look like even in 3 weeks from now, because now they're talking about an emergency joint government as what Israel did in other periods of war in history. But just the last thing that I'll say is where we're at now is there's about 300,000 reservist troops, of whom many of them are my friends and family. I assume I'm not the only one. I know there are people from our congregation, TBT, that are in the IDF or are reservists of the IDF that are now being deployed to the border. I don't believe they've gotten any official orders in terms of going in yet, but Israel's going to be faced with a huge question now as to what to do, because the situation in Gaza hasn't changed. There are 130 people who are kidnapped. And just to talk briefly about the how much, both in Judaism and in Israel's history, it means if somebody's kidnapped. There was a soldier named Gilad Shalit, who I'm sure people are familiar with, who was kidnapped by Hamas several years ago. And Israel ultimately was willing to trade 1,000 terrorists of Hamas who were in jail for various crimes. And when I say crimes, I mean violent crimes, for one guy, Gilad Shalit. Now there are 130 people in captivity. So the situation is horrible. As we know, right, as people who have probably also been refreshing the news every 20 minutes like me, Israel has been very strategically trying to bomb sites in which they think Hamas infrastructure is there. But ultimately, there's going to have to be an entire policy change towards this area because Hamas was able to trick Israel. I mean, there's no way around it. For the last 2 or 3 years, Hamas was absolutely quiet, to the point where there were rockets that were sent about a year ago. I don't know if people are, I mean, sadly, it's a frequent occasion, but about a year ago, there was a series of rockets that were launched by Gaza into Israel. And immediately, Hamas issued a public statement to Israel, apologizing for the rockets and saying, this was not us. These were lone wolves, or this was the other terrorist group, Islamic Jihad. Israel then sent the Mossad to kill those terrorists, and Hamas allowed them in, right? So Israel finally thought, right? And whether this is all sinister or whether this is Israel not paying attention, again, I don't know. But Israel finally thought that Hamas was at least becoming like a little bit more peaceful. Maybe they're going to evolve into a government, not that Israel is going to love, but that is at least keeping calm there. And then this happens. And so it's become clear that Israeli policy, it has been untenable towards the Gaza Strip since 2005. And that is where we are at now. This is just for people who are curious, the map from the armed militant groups on Shabbat morning. And just one last thing to say, I was, again, I've been watching too much news. And so Israel has by now been able to clean up all Hamas presence in Israel. This is also the first time in history that there's been a breach of an Israeli border, not by a foreign country, but by a group of terrorists. So that's also, of course, a turning point. These are all the various attacks. There were also some attacks from sea and also from air. When they've captured some of the Hamas militants, they interrogated them, of course, to try to get more information. And in interview after interview, the Hamas militants are saying, and again, at least the Israeli security teams are treating these comments seriously, so I will too. Hamas militants are saying, we were shocked by how successful this operation was. We did not think, right? The reason why what they're saying is we had 15 different entry points is because we figured the IDF has to be waiting for us. And so maybe we'll distract them. 12 out of 15 of our squadrons will be intercepted, but they'll be too much for Israeli security and we'll overrun it. And there was no security waiting for them at no heightened security waiting. And so you have all these groups going in. And again, their license was to wreak as much damage and as much havoc, take as many captured people, kill as many people. And again, the images coming out are horrific, right? They're sealed into all of our minds. There was, of course, no differentiation between young and old and soldier and civilian and really anybody. And so this is where we're at now. And again, this is sadly not an event that just lasted Saturday. I mean, even in the last couple of days, it seems like in the north, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon might get involved. We are still yet to see how much Iran was behind this. Iran's been awfully quiet in terms of all of this. And we're in a situation now where, again, we're both grieving and processing the tragic events. And also, there is a fear that Israel is about to be thrusted into a much bigger war that, again, in a couple of years is going to determine both the politics and geography of the region. I know that was a lot. The reason why I wanted this to just be like hardcore politics and history is because I just have gotten so many questions from people asking about one aspect of this and the other. And I hope by now everybody here can understand why this isn't something where if somebody asks, well, why did the Palestinians vote for Hamas in 2006? The answer really does demand the 25-minute explanation of the history before it. And again, the last thing I'll say, just to reiterate this, is just because there's a nuance in the history of the region and this place does not mean there's any nuance in the moral actions of what Hamas has done. And sadly, a lot of people in certain areas of the Western world that are viewing this as a moral equivalency of, well, this is a war and this many Israelis have died and this many people in Gaza have died, right? They're mixing up categories. They're saying, well, this whole thing is a nuanced conflict. The background and the history is nuanced. Killing babies is never nuanced, and an act of war crime and targeting civilians purposely, targeting elderly people, and believe that one of the reports said it was a Holocaust survivor who was killed. There were hundreds of teenagers that were at a music festival. There were babies, right? So obviously that requires zero nuance and just needs the harshest condemnation possible. I am happy to stay for any questions, any thoughts, anything there. Sorry if that just seems like a lot of both intense news and also bad news. There's also some. Oops, I just muted somebody. Sorry, there was a lot of noise in your background. But any and all questions, any thoughts? Susan, go for it. And thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm not a congregant, but this was really fascinating. I have a question about going all the way back to the formation of the State of Israel. Where does how accurate is the narrative that I hear all the time that just the very formation of the State of Israel necessitated kicking tens of thousands of people off land that they'd inhabited for hundreds of years, and that is sort of where the Palestinian diaspora and supposed Holocaust happened? Where does that come from?
Yeah, so it even goes back before that, because the problem, I'm trying to think like how far back in history, right? Zionism took no initial position, at least in terms of what any geography should be, in terms of, I mean, Herzl was extremely naive in terms of his thinking about what was going to happen with the Arabs that were there. I mean, Herzl actually writes in the late 1800s or early 1900s that once Israel builds up infrastructure, all the Arabs are just going to love being a part of this new state because they're going to have better trains and hospitals. And so there was no ill intent from most Zionists. It was, maybe just they weren't paying attention or didn't realize how strong the sentiment was. What happened in 1948, again, is always going to be the subject of endless academic back and forth. It was probably a mix of a couple things. The Arab world at the time had so strongly galvanized against any idea of Zionism that the second it seemed like Zionism was becoming increasingly successful, even during the British Mandate period, we started to see a growth of riots and terrorist attacks, right? There was the famous one in Hebron in 1929. There was a series of riots between 1930 and 1936 from the Arab population. And so tensions were boiling the entire early to mid 20th century. And it got to a point in 1948 where the second Israel was founded, or actually even before, the second the UN left and the British were out, and all of a sudden it was just Jews and Arabs, civil war broke out into the streets the second the partition plan was put out, and the second Israel accepted it. And so it's probably a mix of a couple things. Most of the Arab people who were living in the area, and I'm purposely being vague in terms of what the area is and calling them Palestinians because it's unclear if they would have thought of themselves as Palestinian in 1947, a lot of them took up arms against the Jews that happened to be living near them. I mean, again, you saw the map before. You saw how close everything is to each other. A lot of it was them heeding calls by, again, the heads of Egypt and Syria and Lebanon to leave the area. Those armies will come in, destroy all the Jews, and then they'll be able to have the whole land. And also some of it was calculated Israeli military decision of saying, once there's not going to be peace, once there's going to be a war, we also want to extend our borders and have more defensible borders. And it just so happens that if there's a big Palestinian city living in an area that would make a great airport, maybe it does make sense in the course of a war to specifically try to remove the inhabitants of this city, similarly to the way that there were Israelis that were living in a place called Gush Etzion, and Jordan went in during the 48 war and killed all the Israelis that were there and pushed them out. And so it is messy. It's not right. Like anybody who tries to say that, oh, Israel, was perfect and Israel just, was handing out peace leaflets and, the big bad Palestinians came and refused to make it, right? Like that's obviously an oversimplification, but it was a mix of all of these different factors in this confluence of war. Obviously tensions were high. This was also a couple years after the Holocaust. And so there was a sense of urgency to declare and protect the Jewish state. There was a sense of radicalism from the entirety of the Arab world against having the Jews having a state. And so there were a lot of these stories of like specific villages that either were completely deserted by Palestinians, and then of course Israel never let them back in, or the Palestinians there took up arms, or Israel in some other cases said, no, actually to protect our future state, given the hostilities that we're seeing now, we actually need this land. So we're going to clear this out. So a mixture of any and all. I hope that answers the question.
Can I just follow up a little? Just
yeah, of course.
So, I mean, it sounds really messy. And I mean, I just have so many, I'm very progressive. I have so many progressive friends who, talk about Israel, the whole state of, including Jews, by the way, questioning the legitimacy of the state of Israel to begin with because of displacing Palestinians. And my sense is that it's sort of like how the United States was founded, right? Like there were indigenous people here and we declared our own country and we moved them into places, we put them in different places. Like, is that a fair comparison? And then I'll shut up.
Yeah, it's a great question. I personally don't think it's a fair comparison, personally. Elements of it are for sure, I think, fair. I think we have a tendency as people who live in the West to try to compare a lot of things to our Western framework. The Middle East has always been more complicated. One, just the important, just historical difference is that Jews were indigenous to Israel, and Jews had this 2,000-year connection to the land in everything, right? Our liturgy, our prayers, our rituals, our hopes and dreams. And so it wasn't completely random, right? This wasn't, a couple of Spaniards trying to go off and get rich and, striking gold, and then, there happens to be these poor inhabitants. Who cares about them? Let's kill them, right? Like both in terms of the historic sense, and also in terms of why Jews were coming to this area in the first place. Colonialism is thought of as a violent act, right? Understandably, because it really is. I mean, you're going to a land, you're pillaging it for its wealth, and oftentimes you either don't care for or specifically want to eradicate the population in order to enrich a mother homeland or country. With early Zionism, and this almost hurts to say this from a 21st century moral point of view, but the world worked very differently 140 years ago until how people everywhere thought about morality and politics. It wasn't that Zionists didn't care for, it wasn't that Zionists didn't like the Palestinians or thought they had to remove the Palestinians. It wasn't even on their radar to some extent. I mean, the way in which the land of Israel was, if we took a time machine back to the year 1900, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. It had no special significance. Most of it was swamps. There was a huge rate of disease. It wasn't a farmland because, again, the ground hadn't been tilled in hundreds of years. And it was just a bunch of poor peasants and some farmers and some, ultra-Orthodox Jews that also happened to be living in Jerusalem. I mean, it was not a place that was particularly interesting and exciting. The population was also very small. And so when early Zionists started going there, they just thought, one, based off of everything we started with Herzl and, Jews need to protect the place and everything like that. It was just we're going to come here. Hopefully the Palestinians will one day just, grow to accept us. Again, there were obviously other Zionist philosophies that grew later on that were more like, no, actually, they are really going to try to combat us. We have to do something. But I think in a couple ways it was different than the Americas because there was no moral defense of the colonialism of Spain. There is a moral defense of the idea of self-determination in a people, even if that had to be accomplished with means that we would say are immoral. But again, the world is messy in that sense of, if there wasn't a state of Israel, it could have been much worse from some utilitarian point of view. So like, again, I'm being equivocal because I don't really know in terms of like how the exact moral calculation, right? It's something that I think all thinking people should contend with. I have days where I'm, very right-wing on Israel and days when I'm very left-wing on Israel. Today is a more right-wing day, just for the record. But it is a complicated moral question. But with America, it's not a complicated moral question. And yet the irony is it's only Israel that's being, lambasted as the beacon of colonialism, which again, from a progressive perspective, because I'm also a progressive politically, we all have no problem as progressives understanding that a multi-100-year legacy of racism and slavery and Jim Crow and separate but equal leads to systemic racism in America, that even if the legal systems are equal, still maintains some sort of racism. But yet progressives have trouble seeing that a 2,000-year legacy of anti-Semitism throughout the entire world, mixed with inquisitions, mixed with pogroms, mixed with the Holocaust, mixed with all of these things, there's going to be some of that left over after the Holocaust, right? It's not as if the second the camps are freed after World War II, the world says, okay, we've tried anti-Semitism, right? That doesn't work. Anti-Semitism is now over, right? So some of that anti-Semitism has to carry over. And now, given that Israel and Zionism is the most public-facing Jewish institution in the world, right? Like it doesn't seem like it takes a genius to make the connection of, okay, not that all criticism of Israel or anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but there has to be a pretty large overlapping circle. And that's something that it just seems that the progressive world just has not understood. And it's a shock to me also. Why? And I think it's becoming a shock to a lot of Jewish progressives because of what we're seeing. Sorry for the long-winded answer. Barbara, I see you're raising your hand.
Yes. And I would like to say, because I was alive back then, the Palestinian people were not organized, wonderfully industrialized group of people. They were mostly nomadic. You didn't have big developed cities in that area. It was not like this wonderful land that the Jews took over. when they got there, there was a lot to be done, including trying to get water to every place, including trying to make grows because nothing was growing. So the whole idea that Palestine was this wonderful land where people were doing all kinds of wonderful things is ridiculous. It was a desert land and mostly nomadic people that the UN was gracious enough to let the Jews in because nobody else wanted them.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Sydney, go for it.
I'm on. Okay. I think it's very difficult for us to look back in time and understand the world before nationalism, because if you understood how Europe used to be, it was way more free flowing. And in the Middle East, you had huge groups of Jews in what was once called Babylon and in Northern Africa, and nobody cared. It was great. You talk to Iranians who are older, and they said growing up they had Jewish neighbors, Jewish communities, and it was very much a melting pot around the whole area, and nobody really cared. It was all kind of under the Ottoman Empire. Things were loose, and more these other forces, which you've discussed very well, took over, and suddenly these mixed communities in these mixed neighborhoods started to become difficult. And once the land of Israel was actually declared, it became a bigger problem right there. But it's been a big problem throughout, I don't know, a lot of the world as you start to declare things. This is the way it's going to be, and becoming an intolerance to. And so Jews had been basically run out of all of the other countries where they had been for over 2,000 years. And I don't think people are understanding about that either.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and again, I always have a right wing side and a left wing side, or an optimistic and pessimistic side of me. Part of it is also, right, the history of the world has been extremely messy and violent, and especially the history of the Middle East has been extremely messy and violent, with different empires and religions coming and conquesting. And depending on how far back we want to go, we could say the same. I mean, Islam and the wider Islamic world ended up in the Middle East because of a violent conquest against the Crusaders, who ended up there because of a violent conquest against the Islamic world, who ended up in a violent conquest against the Byzantine Roman Empire, who ended up in a violent conquest of the Jews who were there. And so, like, there also is a certain, this is sort of the way in which history's worked. And again, it's not good that history works that way. And I think it is very nice that we're trying to create liberal institutions in the 20th century and 21st century that hopefully will withstand the test of time, that tells countries like, let's say, what Russia's doing, like, no, the world does not work this way anymore. And also, it can't be that the single time that Jews have done something like that in 2,000 years, when every other empire and nation and religion has done something like that constantly, and all of the chips that have fallen in the world in the 20th century, from every country in Europe doing the terrible things that they did, countries in the Middle East doing the terrible things they did, as Susan said before, the way that the Americas were founded. It can't be that after all the chips fall, everybody looks to the one Jewish state and says, what you guys did was uniquely immoral. See, we have rules, and the way in which you take land doesn't work like that anymore, right? Like, at some point it has to be like, okay, right? Like, Herzl's Zionism was based off of the principle of, I mean, again, Herzl was very pessimistic, right? It bears repeating. I started with that. Herzl was also very anti-religious. Herzl was radically secular. And Herzl, and again, I don't, as a rabbi, I disagree with this religiously and philosophically and morally, but just that if Herzl was in the Zoom call, what he'd be screaming is, what have ethical religious values gotten people in history over the last couple of years, very little in terms of safety. And so if the way that the world works is with power and with militaries and people inflicting their will upon other people in order to keep themselves safe, it's not a good thing, but Jews have to also do that. So like, I don't like that that's my intuition, but I think that it also goes to part of it. And that just kind of is the way that the world has worked throughout history, which again is very bad. And also it can't be that just because one can correctly pinpoint terrible things that Israel did in 1948, and that maybe even Israel continues to do, it doesn't mean that for some reason it delegitimizes the entire enterprise, because a lot of the modern nation states that everybody adores now were doing equally, if not much worse things in the middle of the 20th century. And so it's always, Kathy, did you have a question or a comment? Because I think we have to finish in about 5 minutes, because I told them I'd be done by 7:50.
Hi, Daniel. I just wanted to say thank you to you for, after such a long day, speaking so much. And this was very educational and very interesting. All you said about the history of Israel and all of that. But what my question is right now is, in the US right now, most of us have students in the universities, and with all of these negative messages coming, and because I am from Iran, I have seen what these people are capable of doing. Of course, they're not very sophisticated people, but they are like sheeps, and they follow whatever their clerics tell them to do. And because I've seen it firsthand, I'm a little bit concerned, and I wanted to ask you how safe you feel for our children to go to the campuses tomorrow with all of these negative messages coming from this, Muslim.
It's a great question. It's one that we've taken. I mean, not that this is a Hillel event, but I can tell you as the rabbi for Hillel here, it's one that we have taken very seriously, with talking with campus security and administration. I personally feel safe on campus. I, wear a kippah for the last week on campus. Didn't feel any negativity towards me because of that. I also totally understand why students do feel afraid. And I know that both the Jewish institutions on campus and campus administration is very much trying to ensure, and also just America in general is trying to ensure that everyone feels completely safe. And also it's sad. I had a very sarcastic post yesterday on Facebook, because it is sad that it's only the Jewish community that has to simultaneously grieve for a tragedy and also then worry about their safety during their vigils, right? That's sort of unheard of, right? Usually when something happens to a community, the rest of the world comes out to say, we have your back. And here, at least from campus, right? Because obviously I think the wider world, Biden, the head of the UK, the head of Italy, and the head of France put out a wonderful shared statement. Biden gave a speech either last night or 2 nights ago that was probably the most pro-Israel speech given by any president in American history. So,
yeah,
the mature leaders have our back, but it is scary what we're seeing on social media and campus. So, yeah, I would be happy to talk to you more offline here.
okay.
Yeah, just to give a 2-second answer to Coral, Israel does provide the water and electricity to Gaza. And it's a question of whether or not Israel provides enough, whether or not, right, again, just one other complex moral quandary for everybody to consider in a couple weeks from now, once the initial shock wears off, is what actions are reasonable in terms of dispelling terror. And that's also a question that all societies have had to deal with. It's a very complex moral question. I personally think Israel's gotten it wrong a lot of times in history in terms of, generally we don't like collective punishment, right? We consider that also a war crime. And also, right, the other morally complex side, if we know that the electricity in Gaza is being used as resources in terror production and there's an uptick in terrorism, is it moral to cut electricity? That's a hard question to ask, right? I mean, there's a reason why the trolley problem, do you kill one person to save five, right? It's a reason why there's no yes or no answer to that. So it's the same thing with a lot of these. Have a wonderful night, everybody. You all know have my email,
you.
Facebook, because you all found this link somehow. If anybody has follow-up questions, I am more than happy to talk with any of you about any of this.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm
So
really,
much.
really glad I got the link from you. It was extremely good.
Yeah, I'm
I'm
happy you
really
can.
glad it was recorded because I need to watch it a few more times.
Yes, I will send out this, and I'll can also post it on Facebook so everyone can.
That would be absolutely fabulous
you.
because I have a lot of
Thank
friends
you so much.
that listen as well.
Of course. Well, have a wonderful night, everybody. And again,
Thank
you,
you.
Daniel.
Have a
Good night.
great
of
night.
everyone.
Thank
Nice
you.
to see you.
Bye-bye. Bye.